One of the most common questions I get from people new to Attio is what's actually the difference between a list and a view and when to use each one? I'm going to cover all of that in this video, so let's get started. Okay, so I'm in my demo account here, and you can see I'm looking at views right now. So you can find views within any object that you have, whether that's a standard object or a custom object that you create within your workspace. And views are essentially filters to help you segment and sort your data. So you can see here US companies, for example, that's a view because there's a filter in here. And some of these, like US companies, UK, French, and German companies, these are standard views that Attio creates for your workspace by default. You can delete them if you don't see a need for them or change them, whatever you see fit. And you can see if I click into US companies, the advanced filter here, primary location is United States of America. And there's also a sort here. So if I go and just create a new view from scratch, create new view. Let's say I want to look at all companies where my connection strength is very strong, for example, with strong connection strength. This might not actually pull anything, but just to kind of give you an idea. So when you create a new view, you have to add the columns that you want to see within this view. So that's what's so great about views. You can really customize each view to how you essentially want. So if you want to add in this column like domains, and columns are just attributes, right? So as long as you have this attribute within your workspace, you can pull it into a column. Connection strength, and description and categories, for example. And then if I go ahead and just create a filter, connection strength is, very strong. Okay, like I said, this is my demo account, so we're not really going to see much data in here, but just to give you an idea of how you can build a view, right? And of course, I can add in more filters if I want, so I can convert this to an advanced filter, add in more filters depending on what I want to see. I can also sort the data based on how I want the data to be ordered. So for example, if I want to look at companies by which they were created, for example, then that would be a good use case for sorting. And then if I go ahead and save for everyone, now everyone has access to this view. So everyone within my workspace can now access this view. Now, I recommend using views when you're segmenting your data in a way that's helpful for several team members, so several members in your workspace. When you're creating a view, think about, is this going to be helpful for this person on my team and this person on my team? It doesn't necessarily need to be helpful for every single person, but as long as this is a segmentation that makes sense for several people to see and not just you. So if it's helpful for anyone beyond yourself, essentially. Another good use case for a view is if this is a permanent, more permanent segmentation of data. So what I mean by that is this helpful long term? Is this a segmentation that I will keep coming back to over and over? So it's not a temporary thing. It's a segmentation or, criteria that I'm going to keep coming back to over and over, and that, at least one other team member is going to keep coming back to over and over. That's the way I like to think of views. Others may have different opinions on this, but that's the way I like to think about it. With lists, let me just go on to lists here. Okay, I'm actually going to create a list from scratch just to show you, the process. So start from scratch, companies, new list. So when you're creating a list, you do have to select an object to base the list on. So if it's a contact-based list, then you'll want to select people as the object. If it's companies, then you'll want to select companies, so on and so forth. Okay, create list. Now, You can also choose between table or Kanban, depending on the type of view that you want to see. I'm just going to name this all companies for now. I can't really think of another name right now. Okay, so now you might be thinking, well, what's the difference then? When do I create a list? So in my opinion, I think that you should create a list when it's more of a temporary segmentation. So for example, maybe you have an upcoming event or an upcoming webinar and you want to track the list of companies or the list of people that are going to be attending that webinar. This is a very good use case for a list. And the reason I say that is especially because lists have something called list specific attributes. So you can create an attribute that is just specific to this list. So it just lives on this list and it doesn't clutter any of your objects. So that's why I say temporary segmentation is a really good use case for a list, because you might only need these attributes for a short period of time. Maybe, like I said, it's a webinar event or short-term effort, and you don't necessarily need those attributes on the companies or the people because it's not a long-term effort. Another great use case for a list is if it's segmentation that's mainly helpful for you or for just a couple of your team members. And again, this is case by case, right? But for example, if I'm a salesperson and I want to keep track of, deals that have been assigned to me or companies that have been assigned to me, that would be a great use case for a list, because lists can be private or shared. When you create a new list, it will be private by default, but then you can share it with your team members if it makes sense. Like, for example, again, going back to that webinar list, right? That would probably be helpful to share with several team members versus just yourself. But if I'm just looking at companies that I've been assigned to, then it probably just makes sense to keep the list private to me, because, not all of my or none of my other team members wouldn't necessarily need to see that. So those are two great use cases for lists. Another, good use case for lists. So I have seen people use lists for things like deals and pipelines because they don't necessarily need a full-fledged deals object. So if you have a very simple use case and you don't necessarily want or need to build out an entire object with all of these attributes, and you just want something simple to manage and simple to create, then of course you can create lists as well. So, again, it's a really case by case basis, but I would say those are probably the three main use cases. So as you can see here, I was just about to create an attribute. So I can have a list specific attribute that just lives on here. So for example, if I'm conducting outreach for a webinar or an upcoming event, maybe I can track my outreach status in this list. So that's an idea, right? I can select status as the attribute type and, outreach status, and then include stages here, for example, or maybe, a single select option. You can see that these attributes are all the same as the attributes that you would find on the object. So there's no limitations with the kinds of attributes that you can create on lists versus objects. And just going back to that last use case that I highlighted around simple use cases for lists, customer success, which is also a default template, by the way, that you can use, or of course you can just create your own from scratch. But customer success is a very common use case for kind of that simpler workflow for smaller teams. So, for example, maybe you don't need a full-fledged object dedicated to customer success, but you do want your customer success team to have a dedicated place to go to manage new customers and existing customers. You can have it be where a deal is updated to one and then is automatically added to that customer success list for those customer success team members to see. And that kind of brings me to my next point around, a lot of people ask me, are these lists dynamic or are they static? So you can make it static or dynamic depending on your use case and how you want to manage the list. So either or is doable in Attio. So for example, if I have a list of people here and I know that, let's say I have a filter here, I know that I want to add these people to a specific list, I can just go ahead, select all, and then add to list there. And then I don't have to go in and touch that list again if it's just a one-time list, static list. But let's say I did want it to be dynamic, that's where a workflow would be really useful. So you could have a workflow where, and I'll just show you a very simple kind of setup. You could have a workflow where record is created. Let's say it's a company record. You add a filter here, so the company record does need to match some sort of criteria to be added to that list. That's when you can go ahead, add record to list. So that's your action, right? And then you select your list. So let's say it's, new list here, and then you input the created record is the record that I want to add to that list. So that's just a really simple workflow that you can create to make sure that that list is dynamic if that's what you want. So that way you don't have to worry about manually updating the list, and records will just be, automatically added to that list. And, you can do that for records being updated or created, as you can see here. So yeah, you can make it static or dynamic. Hope you found this video helpful and are leaving with a better understanding of how lists and views work in Attio. If you do want to give Attio a try, I have a link in my description that will give you 10% off your first year if you choose to sign up after your trial. And if you need one-on-one help, feel free to schedule an intro call with me. My link and contact info is in the description. Thanks for watching.